Hey PTC, ever seen Limitless?
That van's gonna rear in that taxi.
What?
The driver's distracted. He's texting. He's going 30 miles an hour. He's 60 feet to stop. He doesn't have room.
What van?
So, did Eddie cause the accident because he knew when it was going to happen? Or if we rewatch Limitless and know exactly when what characters do what, does that mean that we make them do it? Albeit imperfect examples, these can be used to introduce us to the second part of a three-part series, God's omniscience. But before we jump into the implications of God's omniscience, let's understand a few things. First, the Bible never explicitly says that God is omniscient. As I touched on in my last video, this is merely a human construct, and most related attacks stem from a misunderstanding of this. Omniscience is merely the best one-word description Christians have of God's knowledge. It isn't and never could be perfect. How could the fullness of God be captured by the limited nature of language? Second, God's omniscience is limited by his nature. He can't, for instance, know what it's like to not be God. But this doesn't make him any less godly. To be all-knowing in this sense would be a logical contradiction. Third, God exists outside of time. As parts of his creation, the past, present, and future all lie simultaneously before God. If time is a line, to paraphrase C.S. Lewis, then God is the paper on which that line is drawn. And this is critically important, imperative to acknowledge, because the vast majority of issues that people have stem from an inability to entertain ideas and concepts not bound by time. So what does God know? He knows only and all truths, what we might call propositional knowledge, which is basically the idea that God knows the truth of any statement, such as 2 + 2 = 4, or from a different angle, he'd know that Cam Newton was lying if he said he won the Super Bowl. God also has all appropriate non-propositional knowledge being all knowledge that exists outside of propositions or statements, such as how it feels to eat an apple. To have all non-propositional knowledge, however, would be an imperfection, because this would include such things as how it feels to be a sinner, which is obviously counter to God. God's knowledge, though chronologically prior to any human event, is actually logically posterior to it. If that doesn't make sense now, it might make sense once we know that there are three kinds of logically prioritized characteristics of God's knowledge. The first and most fundamental is natural knowledge, or God's knowledge of everything that is necessarily true, such as 2 + 2 = 4, if it is snowing, it is snowing, and this also includes everything that could be, every possibility. The third tier is free knowledge, or God's knowledge of all contingently true propositions. God would know, for instance, that George Bush was president in 2001, but George Bush likely wouldn't have been president in a different world, i.e. his presidency and the knowledge thereof are contingent on God and his creation. Finally and fittingly, in between natural and free knowledge is middle knowledge, or God's knowledge of what every possible person would freely do in any situation, which therefore includes who would choose heaven and who would choose hell. For instance, Jesus knew that Peter would deny him and Judas would betray him. Middle knowledge is not necessary to God, at least not necessary in the same way as natural knowledge, but it is contingent on our freely willed actions. And by God knowing all this, he is basically free to make us however he wants. In a sense, our situation and various characteristics, rich, poor, black, white, gay, straight, almost don't even matter. So in terms of a sequence, as illogical as that is to try to apply to a God who exists outside of time, it would go natural knowledge, knowledge of everything that could be, then middle knowledge, knowledge of everything that would be, and then at this point there would be the divine decree to create a particular world. Though we have to note and we have to acknowledge that our will exists independent of what world God would create. And then finally, after, posterior to God's creation, there would be free knowledge, knowledge of everything that will be. And it's at this point that I think many people would take issue, which is also why I think they'd take issue with the beginning clip from Limitless. If God decides which people to create on the basis of middle knowledge, then if God knew what people were going to do when he created them, he'd be effectively predestining them for hell. And I'll delve more into this issue in the third part of my mini-series next week, where I seek to reconcile God's omniscience and omnipresence against such things as this erroneous conclusion. But for now, I'd encourage you to remember three things. First, that knowledge does not equate to causing. Second, that God exists outside of time, so words such as when and pre don't even apply to him. And then third and finally, middle knowledge is still contingent on our actions. In a sense, we act before God ever knows and decides. So yes, in a way we are predestined, but only if by that we mean that we've predestined ourselves.